It was early March 2004, and Dr. Eugene Malov was a man who had just received very good news. As the scientist headed from his home in Pembroke, New Hampshire, to his small publishing company located just 7 miles away in Concord, he looked out the window of his dark green Dodge Caravan minivan. The narrow local road that would take him to Route 3 and then north to the state's picturesque capital was hemmed in on both sides by a thick border of trees. No matter how many times Eugene made this drive, he was always struck by the natural beauty that surrounded him. And now, as he looked at the postcard perfection of the New Hampshire mountains, forests, and rushing streams, he suddenly felt hopeful that the research he was doing would help preserve the beauty of this environment for generations to come. If his 2 children and his brand new first grandchild were going to enjoy the cool summers and clean air that he'd grown up with, then the United States and the world had to find a power source that was cleaner, cheaper, and safer than burning natural gas or fossil fuels. And Eugene, along with a small handful of other scientists, was absolutely positive that he already knew what that power source was: cold fusion. Also known as low-level nuclear reaction, cold fusion is a revolutionary way to create unlimited energy by forcing a nuclear reaction to take place at room temperature and under normal pressure. It's actually the same kind of reaction that triggers the energy released by the explosion of an atomic bomb. The very good news that Eugene had read that morning was in an email from a high-profile science writer saying that the U.S. Department of Energy had finally agreed to review all the research and evidence supporting cold fusion as a viable energy alternative that should be funded and studied at the government level. Although the upcoming review was not yet public knowledge, Eugene knew that the implications were potentially huge, because up to that point, cold fusion was mostly ridiculed as being a foolish idea straight out of a science fiction novel. But now, if the government stamped their approval on cold fusion, it would totally disrupt the world energy production industry. And more specifically, it would cost jobs and money for a lot of people who worked or invested in fossil fuels. The concept of cold fusion had first made public headlines back in 1989 when 2 electrochemists working at the University of Utah claimed to have discovered the chemical process that led to cold fusion. And for a while, it was the breakthrough in energy research that everyone, including Eugene, was buzzing about. But when no one else could replicate the scientists' results, it didn't take long before people began accusing the electrochemists of faking their results, that cold fusion was just a hoax. But over the years, after reviewing all the science and data, Eugene had gone from being a member of the mainstream cold fusion skeptics club to conducting his own experiments and research that convinced him that cold fusion was possible. In fact, as far as Eugene was concerned, cold fusion was not just a theory. It was a scientific certainty that would transform people's lives and save the planet from global warming. And, especially with the U.S. Department of Energy review adding to his credibility, Eugene knew that he had the brilliance and academic pedigree to totally back up his claim that cold fusion was not just a crazy pipe dream. Back when he was just 23 years old, Eugene had earned both an undergraduate and advanced degree in aeronautical and astronautical engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge, Massachusetts. This college, which is known more commonly by its acronym, MIT, is one of the top science universities in the world. 5 years later, he'd graduate from Harvard, another top-ranked university also located in Cambridge, Mass., with a doctorate in environmental health sciences. But to his friends and his family, Eugene had never been known as a straight-laced, boring academic. While he did love to talk endlessly about his latest experiments in global warming and cold fusion, he also had a totally zany sense of humor and a big personality to boot that often made him the life of any party he attended. Eugene's interest in science extended far beyond the laboratory. He didn't just research the development of new energies, he wrote about the futuristic ways they could be applied. When he was 34, he co-authored a paper about using solar sails to travel to Alpha Centauri, the star closest to the sun. And as a science journalism teacher at both MIT and Boston University, Eugene was popular for his ability to teach students how to turn dry, technical, and scientific findings into language that could capture the public's interest and imagination. In fact, in 1987, because of his acclaim as a scientist who was also a gifted writer, MIT offered Eugene the job of becoming the university's national and local media contact for MIT research, and the chief science writer and director in charge of reporting on all MIT research for the MIT University newspaper, Tech Talk. And during all that time, Eugene continued focusing his energy and genius on what had become his personal crusade, exploring and understanding cold fusion. So 4 years later, in 1991, it did not come as a big surprise to his fellow scientists and colleagues when Eugene published a book on cold fusion that was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, one of the most coveted awards in literature. What did surprise the scientific community was Eugene's decision, also in 1991, to resign from his high-paying job at MIT and to accuse the prestigious university of deliberately hiding cold fusion data so it could protect its reputation and its funding for more conventional nuclear fusion research. After leaving MIT, Eugene totally embraced his new role as an outsider, a highly respected and credentialed scientist and writer who challenged his more traditional and mainstream colleagues to push the limits of invention and theory. He began working as a consultant to U.S. corporations and investment firms doing research and development in cold fusion. In late 1994, he founded his own magazine called Infinite Energy, and with the money from an anonymous donor, he also set up his own nonprofit organization called New Energy Foundation that built a laboratory for testing new technologies. In 1998, Eugene was the technical advisor for the Hollywood thriller The Saint that centers around the theft of a newly discovered formula for cold fusion. Now, in 2004, as Eugene drove along the beautiful New Hampshire country roads, he was known not only for his brilliance and unconventional career path, but for his outspoken and sometimes combative criticism of big oil and the mainstream energy science community. As Eugene turned right onto New Hampshire Route 3, the narrow highway that would take him the rest of the way to his office in Concord, he'd already decided on the headline for the article he'd be writing for the May-June issue of his magazine, Infinite Energy. It would read, U.S. Department of Energy commits to re-examine cold fusion, 15 years of evidence for low-energy nuclear reactions. After pulling into a parking space out front of his magazine headquarters, Eugene hopped out of his car and headed inside where he celebrated this victory with his little 4-person staff. Over the next few weeks, Eugene put off everything else in his life so he could work exclusively on the article for the next issue of Infinite Energy. And only when it was finished did he really turn his attention to another, totally separate, personal problem that had been coming to a head over the last several months. Back in the spring of 2003, a little more than 1 year before the review of cold fusion was announced, Eugene's parents were ready to sell their house in Norwich, Connecticut, where Eugene had grown up. Eugene's dad had been a plumber, and his mom had been a math teacher, and then once they retired, they moved away from Norwich. And for more than a year, the white craftsman-style home on Salem Turnpike in the middle of the old mill town in eastern Connecticut had been sitting vacant. But Eugene, who was an only child, had very fond memories of the house with its arched windows and doorway. He'd spent hours when he was young lying out in the backyard of that house, looking up at the stars while he imagined scenes from the hundreds of science fiction books he loved to read. So he persuaded his parents not to sell the property, but to rent it out instead. This way, they could keep the place that held so many happy memories, and Eugene, who said he would manage the property for a small fee, could pull in some much-needed extra income. Ever since Eugene had left his high-paying job at MIT to focus on his magazine and foundation, money had become tight, especially in the last year when his fundraising efforts had fallen short and he'd been forced to shut down the research lab at Infinite Energy and lay off 3 of his lab technicians. Eugene had even gotten his own real estate license to help cover family expenses and keep his magazine afloat, but it still just wasn't really enough. And so this rental property opportunity was a lot more than just nostalgia. This was a big financial opportunity for Eugene and his wife of 34 years, Joanne. So in May of 2003, Eugene's first tenants at his family's home moved in, Patricia and Roy Anderson. And at first, everything was great. Then, in January and February of 2004, the couple missed paying their rent. As a licensed real estate broker, Eugene knew that he could have started eviction proceedings within 2 weeks of non-payment. But Eugene and his parents did not want to just kick the couple and their 26-year-old son off the property unless that was their absolute only option. But after months of sending the tenants dozens of legal notices that rent was due and never hearing a word back, the matter unfortunately went to mediation, which is when a neutral third party steps in and helps the two sides resolve their issues. Eugene and the tenants would eventually work out an agreement that gave the Andersons until mid-April 2004 to move out of the house. And, true to their word, the Andersons would leave on time, and they would move into a new apartment about 20 minutes away. But despite getting the property back, Eugene knew that it was not ready to be rented out again. Soon, he would have to get over there and make some repairs and do some lawn work and remove some belongings that the Andersons appeared to have just left behind. But for now, with the May-June issue of Infinite Energy finally out on the newsstands, Eugene, who had not had a day off in weeks, decided to take a little break from his responsibilities. So he and Joanne arranged to take a short vacation and go to Seattle, Washington to visit their newly born first grandchild. This flexibility was one of the things that Eugene had enjoyed the most since leaving MIT. He missed the big paycheck, but really, Eugene had never been much of a 9-to-5 company man. Still strong and in good shape, with receding but still thick dark hair, a graying beard, and glasses, Eugene threw himself into physical work and social get-togethers with the same energy that he brought to conducting cold fusion experiments in the basement of his New Hampshire home. His wife, Joanne, was just as outgoing and sociable as her husband, so they were both excited about seeing their daughter and son-in-law, meeting the new grandbaby, and exploring the largest city in the Pacific Northwest. And once there, everyone knew that Eugene would spend at least a few hours in various Seattle coffee shops chatting with environmentally conscious hipsters about global warming. Before leaving for Seattle, Eugene had emailed his colleagues in the scientific community about the pending Department of Energy review of cold fusion, and he urged them to make the potential role for cold fusion a key issue in the 2004 presidential campaign that was now underway. It was clear Eugene wanted to rattle a few cages amongst the cold fusion skeptics. After returning a few days later from Seattle, all Eugene really wanted to do was dive right back into his cold fusion research. But before he could do that, he knew he had to head back down to Connecticut and prep the family property so it could be rented out again. So, bright and early on Friday, May 14th, 2004, Eugene put on his khaki work pants and white t-shirt. He hopped into his Dodge Caravan, decorated with cold fusion decals, and made the 2.5-hour drive south to begin the big cleanup. Eugene liked physical work, and he was actually looking forward to getting the property back in shape. The mediation/eviction process had been quite stressful, and it had cost him some money, but in the end, both he and the Andersons had actually parted on good terms. When Eugene arrived at 119 Salem Turnpike, he felt a familiar sense of affection for the place where he had grown up. The house was set close to the road, and the road was now a lot busier since he was a kid. And then as he kind of looked around, he felt a little pang of regret that so many of the houses on the block that he had grown up with had given way to fast food restaurants and shabby strip malls. There were some big trees on the Malov property, and their driveway extended from Salem Turnpike straight back to a detached 2-car garage and back. Once in the backyard, the house itself blocked the view of the street and muffled the sound of traffic. It was actually one of the property's best selling points, that the backyard felt much more private than the location of the house suggested. Eugene turned his car into the driveway and drove down it until he came to a stop right in front of a big green dumpster that he had rented that was positioned right outside of the garage. After getting out of his car, Eugene walked over to the back door of the house, he unlocked it, and went inside to use the first-floor bathroom. Afterwards, he went back outside, tossed his empty coffee cup into the dumpster, and then he made his way into the detached garage to start clearing it out. Over the next couple of hours, Eugene threw a lot of the junk in the garage out into the dumpster, he cut the grass, and he got a chance to chat with the next-door neighbors and put out the word that, yes, they were looking for some new tenants. Eventually, Eugene went back inside of the house and began removing some of the random possessions that the Andersons had left behind. By mid-afternoon, Eugene had called his wife, Joanne, to let her know that he was making good progress, but there was still a lot to do, and so he probably would not be back until at least 9 p.m. It was late afternoon when Eugene, who was working in the back of the house by this point, heard a car pull into the driveway. From where he was standing, he couldn't see the car because the house was blocking his view, so he just stopped what he was doing and listened for a second. A second later, Eugene heard 2 car doors open and then slam shut in the driveway. Eugene likely believed these were people who had maybe seen his for rent sign, which was out front, and they were just looking for more information about the property. So Eugene made the short walk from behind the house over to the driveway, and when he turned the corner and looked up the driveway toward this new parked car, he had to squint because the sun was beaming down on his face. As he strained his eyes to see who was there, he made out 2 large men he did not recognize walking toward him. Before Eugene could even ask their names or what they wanted, the 2 men rushed up to him and began kind of muscling him backwards. As they did this, they told Eugene very clearly why they were there, at which point Eugene, who's kind of stumbling backwards, began yelling for them to stop and to just leave, but the 2 men did not leave. Instead, they continued to press and muscle him backwards until Eugene was out of sight of the driveway and the main road. Several hours later, at around 10 p.m., Eugene's wife, Joanne, who was at their home in Pembroke, New Hampshire, 2.5 hours away to the north, received a call from a woman who identified herself as Demetrius Granger. The woman was down in Norwich, Connecticut, and while driving along the Salem Turnpike, she'd seen a house with a for rent sign out front, and she called the number, which was Joanne's phone number. She apologized for the late call, but she wanted to know if it was possible to maybe have a look at the property that night. Joanne had not heard from Eugene since their last call several hours earlier, and since he wasn't back yet, she had just assumed he was still at the house working. So she gave Demetrius a description of her husband and his vehicle and told her that if Eugene was still there, she was sure he'd be happy to show her around. About 40 minutes later, Demetrius arrived outside of 119 Salem Turnpike. She didn't see a Dodge Caravan in the driveway, and so she figured Eugene must have left to go back to New Hampshire. But she decided, since she was there, she would still like to just hop out and maybe get a better look at the outside of the property. So she pulled into the driveway, she parked her car, and she got out and began walking down the driveway toward the back of the house. But after walking only a few steps, she suddenly stopped. Then, with her hands shaking, she pulled out her cell phone and she dialed 911. This podcast is at the Norwich Police Department, just 7 minutes away from the rental property. The night dispatcher answered the emergency call. Demetrius told them she was at 119 Salem Turnpike and that she was looking down at the mangled body of a man lying face up in a pool of blood on the driveway. By 11 p.m. that night, Eugene's childhood home was swarming with police and emergency medical personnel. It didn't take long for the 2 lead detectives who arrived on the scene to realize that they were likely dealing with a homicide and a possible robbery. As they approached the victim, they immediately noted that his shoes were gone and his pockets had been pulled inside out. After talking with a terrified Demetrius, who had gone back to sit inside of her car, and after dialing the phone number listed on the for rent sign out in the front yard, it also didn't take the detectives very long to identify the victim as Eugene Malov. Joanne Malov, almost speechless with shock, was able to tell detectives that her husband was in Norwich to clean up the family rental property. She told them that she had expected Eugene home in New Hampshire by now, but she had talked with him earlier in the afternoon by phone, and he had told her that there was just a lot of work to do and that he might be much later than he had thought. When police told her that his van was not in the driveway, Joanne suddenly spoke in a rush and said, "Well, are you sure the body is his? Maybe he already left, and the person you're telling me that's dead, maybe that's not him." But, as gently as they could, the detectives on the phone told Joanne that the man they had found definitely matched her husband's description. Then, the Norwich police called the Pembroke, New Hampshire police and asked them to send an officer over to the Malov house to check on Joanne and to gather any information they could about her husband's activities that day. The Norwich police also put out a be on the lookout, or BOLO, alert for Eugene's car with its distinctive decals and vanity license plate. The crime scene itself was a mess, in part because the yard and driveway were covered with fresh grass clippings as well as litter and debris from the ongoing cleanout of the property. Based on everything they saw, the theory the police came up with was that Eugene had been the victim of a robbery and that after killing him, his attacker had taken Eugene's watch and wallet, removed his shoes, and then fled in Eugene's van. Early the next morning, Norwich police got a call from a patrol officer saying he'd discovered Eugene's Dodge Caravan in a commuter parking lot at the Foxwoods Resort and Casino, located 15 minutes away from the site of the murder. A forensic examination of the vehicle showed no signs of any fingerprints on the steering wheel or on the car door handles. The engine and exhaust pipe were cool to the touch when the car was found, so police knew it had not been driven recently and was probably left there immediately after the murder. Security cameras at Foxwoods didn't help either. The night had been cloudy, damp, and hazy, and there was no footage that showed the vehicle or its driver entering the lot or parking the van. The only time frame that the police could come up with for the killing was that it must have happened between early afternoon, when Eugene called Joanne, and 8:30 p.m., which was when a neighbor had noticed that the Dodge Caravan was no longer parked in the driveway. Within 24 hours of the murder, the news that a prominent MIT scientist and cold fusion advocate had been found dead was making local and national headlines. And it didn't take long before the brutal but straightforward robbery-homicide theory got a lot more complicated. Even as police in New Hampshire interviewed Joanne Malov and her two children, and police in Norwich started tracking down other persons of interest like the Malovs' former tenants, the science community that studied nuclear and cold fusion, as well as other potentially significant alternatives to fossil fuels, began buzzing with rumors and speculation. And the lead detectives on the Malov case were about to get swept up into a high-stakes world of scientific research and intrigue. As police started interviewing Eugene's colleagues and co-workers, his closest friends in the scientific community hinted to police that not everyone would have wanted Eugene to succeed in his quest to discover the secret of cold fusion and a potentially unlimited source of cheap energy. And based on those rumors, and the fact that Eugene's vehicle had been found several miles away with no fingerprints on it anywhere, people began to speculate that this could have been a professional hit or maybe a revenge killing. And these speculations quickly began to appear in the media, with headlines like, "Were those with financial stakes in the big gas and oil companies trying to stop cold fusion research?" Meanwhile, police interviews with the Malov family quickly confirmed that no one in the family had either the motive or opportunity to kill Eugene. But when Joanne told police about the eviction proceedings against Roy and Patricia Anderson that Eugene had been directly involved in, police quickly turned their attention to tracking the former tenants down. Almost immediately, they got a tip from a neighbor who had been friendly with the Andersons that led police to the Andersons' 26-year-old son, Chad Schaefer, who had lived in the house on 119 Salem Turnpike with his parents. And Chad, who was totally shocked at the news of Eugene being found dead, would tell police that he was not directly involved in the eviction proceedings. That was something that Eugene and his parents handled. But his impression was that his parents and Eugene had ended things on relatively good terms. When asked, Chad told police that he had been at his apartment with his girlfriend and newborn baby on the day of the murder. As for his parents, he didn't know for sure where they had been on the day of the murder, but he believed with relative certainty that they had been at their new house in Montville, Connecticut. So police would go to Roy and Patricia's house in Montville, and the couple would be just as shocked by the news about Eugene as their son was, and they would say they were home on the day that Eugene was killed. And when asked about the eviction, Roy and Patricia's story would match their son's. They said that they had not been happy about being evicted, obviously, but ultimately they had managed to end things on fairly good terms with Eugene and his family. And so after the police left the couple's home, they realized that they had no leads. Everything had turned into a dead end. Everyone had an alibi, and no one knew what happened. But soon, the police would catch a huge break, or so they thought. Within days of Eugene's body being discovered, the police actually arrested 2 men for the murder. The men had been on a drug-fueled burglary spree in the Norwich, Connecticut area at the same time that Eugene was killed, and so they seemed like the perfect suspects. But after being held in jail for 4 years, it would turn out the state's forensic lab had actually mishandled a key piece of evidence, falsely linking the 2 burglars to the homicide. While the 2 men would go on to be tried in court for their burglary spree, the state had no choice but to drop the murder charges against them and apologize. But that mistake was much more than just embarrassing for law enforcement. It meant that for the last 4 years that they were focused on the wrong suspects, the police had done nothing for Eugene's murder. They had not investigated anything else. They believed they had their suspects. And so now Eugene's murder was just a cold case. But in November of 2008, which was right after the 2 wrong suspects were released, the state of Connecticut formed a special cold case task force of state and local law enforcement personnel that began aggressively reinvestigating Eugene's murder. 3 months later, they held a press conference announcing that they were now offering a $50,000 reward to anyone from the public who came forward with information that would lead to Eugene's killer. While the task force declined to give any details about their new investigation, Detective Jim Curtis told reporters that during their first 3 months on the case, they had already come up with at least one very promising lead. The news of the possible lead and the $50,000 reward electrified the scientific community. Even researchers and scientists who had disagreed with Eugene about cold fusion had soon realized that his death had left a huge void inside the field of new energy research. And Eugene's friends and his staff at Infinite Energy, who had managed to keep Eugene's publication afloat even after his death, had not only missed him and his brilliant mind, but they also just wanted answers. Who killed Eugene and why? The big new lead that Detective Curtis had referred to during the press conference related to a particular set of keys. On the night of May 14th, 2004, which was the night Eugene was found, the police would immediately notice that the entire property was covered in grass clippings from when Eugene had cut the grass earlier. There were clippings still clumped up on the grass, the clippings were out on the driveway, they had blown into the garage and out into the street in front, and all the litter and debris that was scattered around the property from the cleanout of the house. That too was covered in grass clippings. But there was a set of keys that had a distinctive plastic tag attached to them that had a picture of the sun on it, as well as the name Brittany on the keychain, that were found near Eugene's body, but these keys did not have a single blade of grass on them. Instead, it looked like they were dropped on top of some loose clippings, meaning they had to have been dropped later in the night, well after Eugene had cut the grass. And so maybe these keys were not Eugene's. Maybe they were the killer's keys, and they had accidentally dropped them during the attack. But despite this very promising lead, the police got nowhere with it. Then, roughly 1 year later, in May 2009, a mother of 3 young children, enticed by the $50,000 reward, walked into the Norwich Police Department and announced that she had information about the Eugene Mallove case. The story she would tell police would not only lead them to discover who owned those distinctive keys, But also, her story would completely break the murder case wide open, and it would turn out Eugene's murder had nothing to do with cold fusion. Based on what this woman said and the subsequent police investigation, here is a reconstruction of what really happened to Eugene Malov on the evening of May 14, 2004. On the morning of May 14, 2004, Eugene packed his dark green Dodge Caravan with folded-up moving boxes and bags of rags and cleaning supplies, and then he headed south from his home in Pembroke, New Hampshire, to his childhood home 2.5 hours south in Norwich, Connecticut. He wished now that he had made more in-person visits to the property since renting it out a year ago to the Andersons, because not only had the Anderson family stopped paying rent, but they had also stopped treating the property with any respect. When they finally moved out after the mediation and the eviction, the place had become a total eyesore in the neighborhood. At one point, there were 2 non-working cars on the front lawn, and even though the Andersons did remove them when they left, they did not remove all the remaining extra car parts and bike parts that were all over the lawn, and there was just lots of trash and other debris basically strewn across the entire property. And to top it all off, Eugene would learn that the Andersons had been subletting out the basement of the house to help pay their $1,000 a month rent, which had resulted in a steady stream of kind of sketchy people coming in and out of the house that also did not treat the property with respect. And so when Eugene arrived at the house that morning, his plan was just to go in there and throw away anything the Andersons had left behind. After parking in the driveway in front of the dumpster, Eugene took a quick bathroom break inside of the house before going back outside into the garage to start throwing away whatever was inside of there. Over the next couple of hours, as he did this, he periodically glanced out the front doors of the garage up the driveway to Salem Turnpike, where he could see the curious glances from pedestrians and drivers, some of whom slowed down as they passed by the house to see what he was doing. Eugene likely didn't think much of them and just kept doing this big cleanout. However, what Eugene didn't realize was that one of those passerbys was a relative of the Andersons, and they didn't really know the full picture of what was going on. And so when they saw Eugene throwing away all of the Andersons' stuff, the relative pulled out her cell phone and called Patricia and Roy Anderson to tell them what was going on. A few minutes later, as Eugene was peacefully going about his work, across town at an apartment on Chestnut Street, Patricia and Roy's son, 26-year-old Chad Schaefer, and his 24-year-old girlfriend, Candace, heard Chad's phone ringing. He picked it up, but before he could even say hello, he heard his mother's angry voice. She had just gotten the word from that relative that Eugene was at their old rental throwing out the Andersons' belongings, and she was furious. She had been telling Chad for weeks to get over there and clean out the rest of their stuff, but clearly he had not done that. And so now she demanded that her son get over there and take care of this situation. Chad initially did not do anything. But as he sat there, he started to think about what he might have accidentally left behind at the property that now might get thrown away. And so eventually he decided he would head over and talk to Eugene. But before he headed over there, he decided he needed help from his cousin, 31-year-old Mizelle Brown, who was well known to Norwich police and who had a past history of drug offenses. Mizelle arrived out front of the Chestnut Street apartment late that afternoon. On his way out the door of his apartment to go out and meet Mizelle out on the road, Chad grabbed his own set of car keys from a hook and stuffed them into his jacket pocket. A few minutes later, the 2 men were in Mizelle's car driving over to 119 Salem Turnpike. Once they arrived at the house, they turned into the driveway and they parked behind Eugene's van. As the 2 big men got out of the car and slammed their car doors shut, they saw Eugene step out from behind the back of the house into the driveway, and he was kind of shielding his eyes with his hands, and his face showed no sign that he recognized either of them. The 2 men wasted no time and walked right up to Eugene and began crowding into his personal space, kind of forcing him to start stepping backwards. But despite how intimidating this was for Eugene, when Mizelle and Chad told him who they were and that he had to stop throwing their stuff out right now, Eugene was immediately defiant and said, "No, you had your chance to claim your stuff. "You didn't, now leave." But instead of leaving, Chad stepped forward and threw the first punch in what would become a violent struggle that left Eugene's blood spattered on the side of his childhood home, on the garden hose lying across the backyard, on the doors of the cars parked in the driveway, and on the side of the green dumpster. When Eugene finally fell to the ground face first, Chad and Moselle took turns beating him literally into the ground with a metal pipe they found on the floor of the garage. Eventually, the two men stopped and just stood there in silence, sweating and breathing heavily while they stared down at the horrible damage they had inflicted on Eugene. Then, almost like snapping back to reality, the two men looked around them to see if anyone had seen them. But when they looked around, it was quiet, and they noticed that where Eugene had fallen, his body was kind of blocked from view by the dumpster and his van and their car, and so no one could even see him, even if they were looking in their direction. And so the two men, satisfied they were in the clear and that they would not get caught, they just casually hopped back into their car, they backed out of the driveway, and they drove back to the apartment on Chestnut Street. When Chad and Moselle walked through the front door, Chad's girlfriend, Candace, immediately saw their clothes were covered in blood. But before she could absorb what the two men told her, that they had, quote, beat the shit out of their landlord, the two men told Candace that she now had to come with them and help them make their murder look like a robbery. Candace put her newborn baby in the crib, and then she, Chad, and Moselle left the apartment and returned to 119 Salem Turnpike. But when they got there and they parked in the driveway and approached Eugene's body, Chad and Moselle were stunned to find that Eugene was still alive. He was still breathing. When they rolled him over, Eugene opened his eyes and looked up at his attackers and began pleading with them to help him as the blood began to spill out of his mouth. As Candace started to back away, Moselle reached out and caught her by the arm and dragged her back to Eugene's body. And Chad pushed the metal pipe they had used earlier to beat Eugene into Candace's hands. And then Chad pointed at Eugene and said, "Hit him." When she didn't respond, Chad slapped her and said if she didn't do as he told her, they'd kill her too. And so Candace gripped the pipe, she raised it over her head, and as she did this, Eugene begged them to stop. But seconds later, that pipe came crashing down directly onto his face. After she hit him, she handed the pipe back to her boyfriend, and then Chad and Moselle began taking turns smashing and kicking Eugene's face and body until they were so tired they had to stop. By the end of the second beating, Eugene would have 32 significant lacerations on his face and neck, and a stab wound on his right forearm. But amazingly, at the end of this second beating, Eugene was actually not dead yet. And so with no more energy to use the metal pipe or to kick him, Moselle Brown, who was a very big guy, just stepped directly onto the front of Eugene's throat and shifted all of his weight to that foot and began digging it into his neck. He would stand there grinding his foot left and right into the scientist's throat, breaking bone and cartilage until finally Eugene stopped squirming and died. After Moselle climbed off of Eugene's neck, the trio staged the scene to look like a robbery, taking Eugene's wallet, wedding band, watch, and digital camera. Then the men gave the keys to Eugene's van to Candace and told her to drive the van to the parking lot at Foxwoods Casino, where Chad's stepfather worked, and to make sure she wiped any of her fingerprints off of the car's steering wheel and door handles. Later that night, after Chad and Moselle picked Candace up at Foxwoods, the three would go back to the Chestnut Street apartment. Before Moselle left, all three of them stripped off their bloody clothes, which Candace bundled into a laundry basket for washing later. Candace stuffed the items they had stolen from Eugene into a box that she shoved into the back of a closet and then later burned. When Norwich police arrived at the Chestnut Street apartment the day after the murder to question Chad about his possible involvement in Eugene's murder, Chad and Candace gave each other alibis, and Chad was highly cooperative, giving police the address of his mom and stepdad. It wouldn't be until later that day that Chad would realize he had dropped his car keys at the scene of the crime. Those were the distinctive keys with the plastic tag and the name Brittany on the keychain that the cold case task force had zeroed in on for not having grass clippings on them. The name Brittany was the name of Chad's daughter from an earlier relationship with an ex-girlfriend. In 2009, when billboards went up around Norwich advertising a $50,000 reward for any information that led to Eugene Malov's killer, Candace's good friend, Jill Sebastian, suddenly felt inclined to talk. So she was the woman who had gone into the Norwich police station and said she had information about the murder. It would turn out Jill had seen that bundle of bloody clothes at Candace's apartment around the time of the murder. Not only would Jill's boyfriend, Keyshawn Delavan, confirm Jill's story, but he also told police that he had personally heard Chad and Moselle boast about beating the Andersons' ex-landlord to death. The couple also told police that Chad and Moselle had been selling crack cocaine out of the Malov rental property, and that when they heard that Eugene was doing a cleanout, they started to worry that he might find some of those drugs in the garage. And so when they went over there, they really needed Eugene to stop. Once police brought Candace in for questioning and offered her a plea deal in exchange for her cooperation, Candace would identify the keys found at the crime scene as belonging to Chad. She also described Moselle's involvement as well as the role she herself had played in the murder. After being entered into the witness protection program along with Jill and Keyshawn, Candace agreed to testify against Chad and Moselle. In 2008, 4 years after Eugene's death, the Malov family house at 119 Salem Turnpike in Norwich, Connecticut, was torn to the ground. 4 years after that, on April 20th, 2012, Chad Schaefer pled guilty to first-degree manslaughter and accessory to third-degree robbery and was sentenced to 16 years in prison. 2.5 years after that, on October 24th, 2014, Moselle Brown was sentenced to 58 years in prison. And about 7 months after that, on May 27, 2015, Candace Foster, who served 4 years and 10 months in prison while awaiting trial, pled guilty to hindering prosecution and tampering with evidence and was sentenced to 5 years probation. Back in December of 2004, 7 months after Eugene was killed, the Department of Energy would finally release its report on their review of cold fusion research. While they stopped short of endorsing cold fusion as a viable energy source, they did recommend that funding agencies should entertain individual, well-designed proposals for experiments involving cold fusion. According to a close colleague of Eugene Malov, while the report certainly fell short of what Eugene expected, the colleague believes Eugene still would have welcomed even the smallest steps along a new scientific path into the future. Ever since he was a child, Mark Twitchell had always dreamed of becoming a big-time Hollywood filmmaker. But he knew the odds were stacked against him because he lived in Edmonton, Canada, which was not exactly known for being a movie-making hub. Nonetheless, after high school, he enrolled in an Edmonton art college, and in 2000, he graduated, earning his degree in radio and television art. But after college, despite utilizing his training to make several films, none of them generated any buzz beyond his friends and family, and so it seemed like his filmmaking career was turning into a bit of a dud. However, in 2007, Mark had a bit of an unintentional breakthrough. He had been a longtime Star Wars fanatic, and that year, he decided, purely as a passion project, he was going to write a script for a prequel to the Star Wars franchise. When he finished it and shared the script with some of his colleagues, they were so impressed with his writing, they said, "Mark, you need to produce this into a movie. This is incredible." And so Mark, who was totally amazed at this unbelievable feedback he was getting, decided, you know what the heck, I will produce this movie. And so he began sending his script out to different actors and actresses to see if they might be interested in playing a role. And amazingly, one of the original Star Wars actors, Jeremy Bulloch, who played Boba Fett, he read the script and he was so impressed by it that he agreed to play a role in Mark's film. And so this passion project had quickly turned into Mark's biggest success yet. When the movie was finished, it did well, but it didn't didn't propel Mark into Hollywood stardom. However, it did put him on the map as a bona fide filmmaker, and it showed him that if he just focused on making films about subjects he was already very passionate about, those films would be much more likely to succeed. And so in 2008, so roughly a year after creating the Star Wars fan fiction film, Mark decided to embark on another film project around another passion of his, Dexter. Dexter was a very popular TV show about a fictional serial killer whose name was Dexter, and the way Dexter would kill his victims is he would lure them into these small rooms, which he called kill rooms, and inside of them, basically every surface, the ceiling, the walls, the floor, were all covered in plastic sheeting to catch any of the blood, and then he would kill his victims, usually with a knife, and then afterwards he would dismember them and bag up their body, and he would roll up all this plastic, kind of collecting all the evidence, and then he would dump the plastic and the body into the ocean. Mark was obsessed with the show, and so it inspired him to make his next movie be about a killer too. Except instead of it being fiction like Dexter, he wanted his movie to be at least based on real events. And it just so happened, at the time he was thinking about doing this movie, there was this uncaught murderer terrorizing Edmonton, and so Mark decided the Edmonton killer would be his star. Mark would spend the next several weeks obsessively researching the Edmonton killer and his victims and establishing a clear timeline of what had happened with this case, and then after he felt like he had compiled every piece of information he possibly could, he used that research to concoct a 42-page first draft of his script. And as soon as he was done with that first draft, it somehow got leaked. And when it got leaked, the contents of this script were so shocking and so controversial that the script wound up in the hands of the Edmonton police. And when they read the script, they immediately recognized they had a big problem. They reached out to Mark and they told him under no circumstances can you turn this script into a movie, and then the police basically wiped this script off the face of the earth. Today, if you go looking for Mark's script online, you'll basically only find heavily censored versions of it. But recently, I got my hands on an uncensored version of this 42-page script. Now, I'm not going to literally read you this script. However, what I'm going to do is use the script's information to tell you Mark's highly controversial Edmonton killer story. As you listen, remember this story is based on actual events, and so the victims' names and the information about them is real. Okay, here we go. In early October 2008, a soft-spoken 26-year-old casino security guard named Giles Tetreault was living alone in Edmonton. Giles's life had recently been turned upside down because a few months earlier, his wife had told him that she just didn't love him anymore and that she was going to leave him. Giles was still very much in love with his wife, and so this was a totally heartbreaking experience for him. After she left, Giles tried to stay busy and keep his mind occupied, but it rarely worked. Oftentimes, he felt crushingly lonely and sad. But on Friday, October 3rd, when Giles came home from work that afternoon, he suddenly felt like, you know what, I gotta get my life together and I'm gonna start by finding myself a new romantic partner. And so he went on a dating site and he made himself a profile and he began scrolling through all of the women's profiles that lived roughly in his area. And at first, no one really appealed to him, but then he stopped on this one woman's profile. She was this young, blonde, beautiful woman named Sheena, and she lived right in Edmonton. And so Giles thought, what the heck, I'll send her a message. And so he did, just introducing himself and asking to talk further. And she responded just a couple of minutes later. And then over the next couple of hours, the two exchanged dozens of messages, getting to know each other. And then finally, Sheena just says to Giles, hey, you know, we live so close together. Why don't we get together tonight and go grab dinner and watch a movie together? And Giles is thrilled. And he says, yeah, I'll come pick you up. What's your address? And Sheena would tell him, you know what? I don't feel comfortable sharing my address over this dating website. And so instead, she sent Giles this strange customized set of directions that didn't give the actual address of her house. Instead, it basically gave Giles a set of known landmarks in Edmonton that he could follow until he finally arrived at her residence. And she also told him that when he arrived, instead of just coming up to her house, there would be a detached garage and the door would be open and he would go through the garage, out the door into her backyard, and then he would go up the back steps to the back door of her house house, and she would meet him there. Now, Giles did think this was a little bit strange, but at the same time, he's thinking, you know, I am basically a complete stranger to her. We just met today on the internet, and so I really can't blame her for taking some extra safety precautions with me. And so he told Sheena he had no issues using her special directions, and then he said he'd be over soon. And so Giles hopped in the shower, he freshened up, he got dressed, he hopped in his truck, and then he began driving to Sheena's house. After about 15 minutes of following these directions, he reached the end of them, and they placed him in this alleyway in a suburban neighborhood. And where he stopped, he looked off to his right, and he saw there was this 2-car garage, and he knew it was Sheena's garage because one of the doors was open like she said it would be, although the door was not open all the way. It was open enough to where he would have to duck to get into the garage, but either way, he knew it was her garage. And so he turns off his truck and he gets out and he tries to look up at Sheena's house behind the garage to see if maybe he can see her looking out the back door, but the detached garage that was right up against the street was kind of blocking his view, and so he thought, okay, whatever, I'll just go in and make my way up to the back steps. And so he walks over to this 2-car garage and he goes to the open side, he ducks down and he goes underneath and he stands up inside of the garage. Now, it was dark inside of the garage, there was no light on, but there was enough light spilling in from the opening of the garage door that he could see there was really nothing in the garage. However, virtually every surface, the walls, the ceiling, the floor, was covered in plastic sheeting. Now, he had no idea what this plastic sheeting was for, and he really didn't care. He just kept walking across the garage towards the door that would lead into Sheena's backyard. And when he reached that door, he reached down to the door handle and he was about to turn it when he felt a blinding pain in the back of his neck. He whipped around, and even though it was dark inside of this garage, he could clearly see this huge man in a black and gold hockey mask standing right in front of him holding a stun baton. Giles tries to run past him to try to get out of the garage, but the man grabs him and then takes his stun baton and drives it into Giles' stomach, and he pulls the trigger. And immediately Giles feels this coursing pain in his torso and he falls to the ground, and then this man in the mask releases the trigger and Giles tries to scramble up to his feet to try to run out of the garage. But as soon as Giles turns around, he stops where he is because he sees this huge guy in the mask is standing between him and this open garage door, and he's now holding a gun in his hand and he's aiming it right at Giles. And so Giles freezes. He has no idea what's going on, and this man who's got this mask on barks at Giles to get on the ground and put your face on the ground. And so Giles at this point is thinking, I'm going to get killed in here. I have nothing I can do. I'm completely defenseless here. And so he just does what he's told, and he lies down on the plastic sheeting and he's totally terrified. And this man walks over and he puts a piece of duct tape over Giles's eyes. And so as he's laying there blind and terrified, Giles becomes very emotional. He suddenly longs for his ex-wife and for his family and his friends. He wishes he could see them just one more time, and he knows he's not going to. Then, as he's laying there, he's coming to the stark realization that he didn't tell anyone where he was going. And so if this masked maniac does kill him, who's going to find his body? Will his family and friends ever know what happened to him? So as he's laying there thinking of these horrible thoughts, he hears his attacker, who's several feet behind him, start fiddling with what sounds like chains or handcuffs. And Giles thinks to himself, if I get chained up in here, I really am done. And so he has this sudden surge of adrenaline where he thinks to himself, I'm going to get killed in here. I know it. I'm going to get killed. But if I'm going to die, I'm going to die on my terms. And so Giles takes a deep breath and then jumps to his feet, rips the tape off of his eyes. He turns around and he faces his attacker and he says, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to go out this way. And the attacker is totally surprised, but he just begins to raise his gun at Giles to shoot him. And Giles lunges forward and he grabs the barrel of the gun and he pushes it away from him. And as soon as he does that, Giles realizes something. The gun is made of plastic. It's fake. And so Giles is suddenly so confident, he grabs the arms of his attacker and he tries to kick the guy in the legs, but the attacker is so much bigger and stronger than Giles that he just headbutts Giles. Giles goes flying to the ground and his attacker jumps on top of him and begins punching him and slamming his skull into the ground. But Giles is so high on adrenaline, he can't feel any of the blows. All he's trying to do this whole time as he's getting pummeled is just find a way to stand up and run out of this garage. Just get out, escape. And amazingly, against all odds, he does manage in between blows to wriggle his way out of the attacker's grasp. But as he begins to run towards that opening in the garage door, the attacker grabs him by the jacket. And so Giles twists himself and he actually comes out of the jacket. And then he throws himself onto the ground and he rolls out of the garage. And as soon as he is free, he suddenly can't stand up. The stun baton, he didn't feel it before, but it had sapped all of his strength. But the adrenaline had kind of overridden that feeling. But here he is outside and he suddenly can't stand up. And so he's trying to stand up, and then the attacker, who's still inside, dives down, reaches out from underneath the garage and grabs Giles by the ankle and begins trying to pull him back into the garage. And so Giles is kicking and screaming and punching, and he finally breaks free. And then he has another surge of adrenaline and he stands up and just begins running down the alleyway. Doesn't even go to his car. He just starts running towards, hopefully, civilization. And he makes it a couple of houses before he collapses to the ground in this very busy walking trail. And so he's landed right in this intersection where he's hoping someone's going to be. He turns back and looks down the alleyway and he sees his attacker, who's now on the road. He's got the mask still on his face and he's charging up the road. Giles can't even get up. He's so tired, but Giles looks to his side and he sees there's this random couple walking down the walking path. They see Giles on the ground who's calling out for help, and they run over to him and they get right in front of Giles, and Giles immediately points at the attacker coming down the alleyway and says, "He's trying to kill me." And the attacker amazingly just jogs right up to Giles, right up to the couple. He does not take his mask off and he acts like he's friends with Giles and says, "Oh, come on, Frank, you're making a big deal out of it. It's a game. Come back to the garage. I'll meet you there." And then the attacker just turns around and walks back down the alleyway back towards his garage. And so Giles turns and looks up at the couple, who are totally freaked out by this whole situation. They don't know if this is some weird setup that they're going to get robbed or something. They don't know if this is a hoax. And so they say, "Hey, you're on your own, pal." And they turn and they leave. And so Giles is left in the middle of this intersection. The only people that could have helped him are now gone. And so he rolls over and just looks down the alleyway in the direction of the garage. And he can actually see his attacker pacing back and forth inside of the garage because that door is partially open. And so Giles doesn't know what to do. He has to get to his truck to get out of here. And so he just sits there for a couple of seconds, just watching the attacker, making sure he's staying inside of the garage. And then finally, he just took a deep breath. He pulled himself up and he stumbled down the alleyway. He got in his truck, fired it up, and he peeled out of there. When Giles got home, he was obviously traumatized from this horrible thing that had just happened to him, but he also felt embarrassed and kind of ashamed that he had clearly just gotten catfished by the psycho in the garage. Obviously, Sheena, the woman he supposedly was talking to, was not real. It was that guy in the garage that had attacked him, but he didn't really understand why it had happened. He had no idea why anyone would target him, and so the whole situation was just such a mess. He decided, you know what, I'm not going to tell anyone. He didn't report it to the police. He didn't tell his friends. He didn't tell his family. He just decided he was going to move on and forget about it. A week later, on October 8th, another Edmonton man, 38-year-old Johnny Altinger, was perusing the dating website that Giles had been using. Johnny made a living doing quality control for an oil and gas company, but he hated that job. He much preferred to spend his time tinkering with his computers or his prized motorcycle. Johnny had lots of very close friends, but romance was always something that had eluded him. So that afternoon, Johnny, like Giles, was on this dating website to potentially find a romantic partner. And so as he was scrolling through all of these different women's profiles that lived roughly in his area, he wasn't interested in any of them until he stopped on this one profile of this beautiful young blonde woman named Jen, who lived right in Edmonton. And so Johnny was interested. He sent her a message, and very quickly she wrote back, and before long the two are chumming it up, and then eventually they actually agree to get together that night for dinner and a movie. But when Johnny asked Jen for her address, she would tell him that she's a paranoid person and she doesn't want to give him her actual address over this website, and so instead she gave him a set of very strange directions that relied on local landmarks in Edmonton to guide him into her residence. And she would tell Johnny, when you get here, go through the garage, the door will be open, go out the back door, go into the backyard, make your way up to the back of the house, and I will meet you at the back door. And so Johnny definitely thought these directions were very strange, but he was really eager to meet up with Jen, and so he really didn't care. And so he told Jen it was no big deal, he'd happily follow her directions, and then he hopped in the shower and he got himself together, and then before he left to go to Jen's house, he forwarded Jen's email that included her very strange directions. He sent those directions to one of his very close friends, and he kind of jokingly included a message that was like, hey, if I go missing tonight, this is where I'm going. And then Johnny hopped in his car and he left. The directions brought Johnny to the same garage in the same alleyway that Giles had been to a week earlier. And when Johnny came to a stop in front of Jen's two-car garage with one of the doors partially open, he saw there were lights still on inside of the garage, and he saw someone walking around inside. And so Johnny looked at his watch and he realized he was maybe 15 or 20 minutes too early. And so he parks his car and he's thinking, okay, Jen might be inside of this garage and I'm early, but maybe I'll just walk over and say hi to her. I'm sure she wouldn't mind. And so Johnny turns off his car, he gets out and he starts walking over to this half open garage door. And as he gets closer and closer, the lights in the garage go off. And so Johnny stops and he's thinking, why are the lights off? Did she hear me? Does she not want me to come in? What's going on? But he's thinking, okay, well, I should definitely go over and say something. And so he walks over to this open garage door and he bends down and he looks inside and it's totally dark. And he just says, hello? And there's a pause, and then the lights come on, and Johnny suddenly sees this garage that's basically devoid of anything, minus a table off to the side, and every surface is covered in plastic sheeting. The floors, the walls, the ceiling, everything. And in the back of the garage is not Jen. Instead, it's this man he doesn't recognize. And so Johnny's looking at this man, and this man is looking over at Johnny, and finally the man speaks and says, hi, I'm Harry. I'm a designer. I rent this garage out from Jen. And I just talked to Jen, and you're meeting up with her tonight, right? You're meeting up with Jen? Yeah. She's running late. So I think she'll be back in about maybe 20 minutes. So can you come back in 20 minutes, come right back here, come to the garage, and I'll bring you up to the house because I know you're meeting her up at the house. So 20 minutes. And so Johnny doesn't really know what to make of this. He figures, okay, I don't really know what Jen's arrangement is with this designer in this plastic covered garage, but whatever. And so Johnny says, okay, no problem. I'll come back in 20 minutes. And so Johnny turns around and he walks back to his car and he leaves and drives around for about 20 minutes. And then he comes back to the garage. And as soon as he parks, he notices right away the light in the garage is now off. So presumably Harry has actually left. And so he will not be available to walk Johnny up to the house to meet Jen. But Johnny was thinking, I don't really want to interact with Harry. He seems like a strange guy anyways. And so he counts this as a win. And so Johnny parks his car, he hops out, he walks over to the garage, he bends down and goes inside of the garage. He stands up and he walks across the plastic lined floor to the door that's going to lead out into Jen's backyard. But before he reaches that door, something smashes into the back of his head. And immediately Johnny is horribly dazed and he instinctively throws his hands up to protect his head, and he begins spinning around trying to figure out who or what had just hit him. And as soon as he turns around, he sees in the shadows is the figure of none other than the man he saw before, Harry. And Harry is holding a big metal pipe. And immediately when Johnny sees him, he begins screaming, police, police, police. And Harry just winds up and wails on Johnny with this metal pipe. And Johnny's trying to turn around and get away from Harry, but Harry just keeps moving around him and beating him with this pipe until finally Johnny collapses on the ground, but he's not unconscious. And so Johnny is kind of shielding his head and he's looking up at Harry, who's now just standing over him. He's ceased his initial barrage. And Johnny begins pleading with Harry, I'll give you money. I'll give you anything. Just please let me go. And so Harry smiles and he says, you promise you won't tell anyone if I let you go? But before Johnny could answer this, Harry winds up with his pipe and he brings it crashing down on Johnny's face. But amazingly, this does not knock Johnny unconscious. Instead, Johnny grabs the pipe after it hits him in the head and he holds onto it to prevent Harry from hitting him again. And so at this point, Harry is frustrated that Johnny is still putting up this huge fight. And so with one hand holding onto this pipe that Johnny has the other end of, Harry reaches down with his other hand and he unsheaths a hunting knife. And he holds the blade right in front of Johnny's face. And as soon as Johnny sees this knife, his eyes go wide and he lets go of the pipe and he begins to plead bleed for his life. But Harry just smiles and continues to show him the blade, and then at some point he grabs Johnny's shoulder, he pulls the knife back, and he plunges it into Johnny's stomach. Johnny howls out in pain, and he curls over, and he begins screaming for the police, screaming for someone to help him, and then finally Harry pulls the knife out of his stomach, and then plunges it into the side of Johnny's neck. And then Harry lets go of the knife, and he stands up, and he just watches Johnny as he bleeds out onto the plastic lining. As Harry watched Johnny die, he had this pang of regret. He thought to himself, why didn't I play more mind games with him before I killed him? I'll do that with the next one. After Johnny died, Harry would dismember and bag up Johnny's body, and then he would roll up all of the plastic from the walls and the ceiling. He'd gather that all up, and then a couple of days later, he would dump both Johnny's body parts and all of the plastic containing all of the evidence down a nearby sewer drain. At this point in the story, Mark's script just kind of comes to an abrupt end. We don't know what Harry did after getting rid of Johnny's body and the evidence because Mark just didn't write it. It was like he didn't finish the script. And there's a reason for that, and it's the same reason the police stepped in and stopped Mark from making this script into a movie. At the time they read his script, the police had already figured out who owned the garage where Giles and Johnny were attacked. Johnny's friend, the one who Johnny had forwarded Jen's email that had those strange directions, well, that friend gave those directions to the police once Johnny had been reported missing. And so the police followed these strange directions to this garage, and they discovered it was not owned by some young, beautiful blonde named Jen or Sheena. It was not owned by some designer named Harry. It was owned by a young, up-and-coming filmmaker named Mark Twitchell. But to this point, Mark had been extremely cooperative with police and allowed them to search it, and they found nothing. And he explained to them he was not remotely the only person with access to this garage, not by a long shot. But when police searched Mark's laptop, they found a hidden document, and this document was his 42-page script. And when they read it, they saw there was a huge issue. Giles, the first victim of the Edmonton killer, had eventually gotten over his embarrassment and shame, and he went to the Edmonton police and he told them in detail what happened to him inside of that garage. But Giles was so scared he had not told anybody else what had happened. The only people who knew were himself and the Edmonton police. Yet somehow, in Mark's script, the account of what happened to Giles was exactly correct. Every little detail of what happened to Giles was encompassed inside of this script. And the reason Mark had this information is because Mark was in the garage when Giles got attacked. Because Mark was the Edmonton killer. Mark had been so desperate to make his killer in his new movie as good as Dexter in the TV show that Mark decided he needed to literally become Dexter in real life. He needed to know exactly what it felt like to lure an unsuspecting victim into a kill room and murder them so that he'd be able to more accurately write about it in his script. He believed this would put his movie over the top. It would be the most authentic killer movie ever, and it would be his ticket to Hollywood. And so after Mark used a fake dating profile to trap and then attack Giles, after that experience, he wrote about it, and that became his script. And then when he did the same thing to Johnny and then actually successfully killed and disposed of him, he sat down and wrote about that experience too and tacked it onto the end of the Giles attack. He was literally living his movie and writing the script in real time. The title that Mark gave his script was SK Confessions, which stood for Serial Killer Confessions. And that's exactly what the script was. It was a real confession. And based on the way his script just kind of abruptly ends without any sort of conclusion, it seems fairly obvious that Mark was planning to kill more people and then incorporate those experiences into this script. Ultimately, though, the script that was found by police was used to convict Mark of murder, and he is currently